Welcome back to Mystery Minds, the channel where we dive into the darkest corners of true crime, uncovering stories that shock, intrigue, and leave us questioning the world around us. In today's case, we bring you a gripping tale of power, betrayal, and ruthless ambition. This is the story of Lucky Luciano and the Atlantic City Conference, building a crime empire. A tale of vision, treachery, and calculated alliances. This story will leave you wondering, how did one man's ambition reshape organized crime forever? And what price did he pay for his iron grip on an empire built in the shadows? Stay with us as we unravel the rise of a criminal mastermind and the pivotal meeting that changed the world of organized crime forever. Atlantic City, 1929. A storm rages outside a luxury hotel. Inside, the world's most dangerous men gather not to fight, but to join forces. Behind the closed doors of a smoke-filled room, a vision is born, and the future of organized crime is forever changed. But at what cost? And who will be the first to fall when trust among criminals becomes the ultimate gamble? Charles Lucky Luciano was no ordinary criminal. Born Salvatore Lucania in a small Sicilian village in 1897, he immigrated with his family to New York City at the age of 10. The bustling streets of Manhattan's Lower East Side exposed him to the harsh realities of immigrant life, where survival often meant bending or outright breaking the rules. By the time he was a teenager, Luciano had already embraced the criminal underworld, quickly earning a reputation for his sharp mind, unrelenting ambition, and ability to inspire loyalty. As a teenager, Luciano started his own gang and became a member of the old 5 Points gang. Luciano offered protection to Jewish youngsters from Italian and Irish gangs for 10 cents per week. Luciano met Meyer Lansky as a teenager when Luciano attempted to extort Lansky for protection money on his walk home from school. Luciano respected the younger boy's defiant responses to his threats, and the two formed a lasting partnership. By the 1920s, Luciano was well on his way to becoming a prominent figure in organized crime. Luciano had met many future Mafia leaders, including Vito Genovese and Frank Costello, the latter a longtime friend and future business partner, through the 5 Points gang. He aligned himself with Joe the Boss Masiria, one of the most powerful Mafia leaders in New York. Under Masiria's guidance, Luciano learned the ways of the old Mafia, where loyalty, tradition, and family ties were paramount. But as Luciano's influence grew, so did his dissatisfaction with these old-world principles. To him, the rigid, hierarchical system of the Mafia was outdated, a relic that stifled potential profits and bred unnecessary conflicts. Luciano envisioned a new way of doing business. He believed in running organized crime like a corporation, prioritizing efficiency and profit over petty feuds and territorial squabbles. His vision extended beyond the Mafia's traditional ventures in bootlegging and gambling. He saw opportunities in labor racketeering, drug trafficking, and even infiltrating legitimate businesses. But such an ambitious plan required more than just ideas, it required power. Masiria, deeply rooted in tradition, was an obstacle to Luciano's vision. Their relationship began to fracture as Luciano quietly built alliances with other crime bosses who shared his progressive outlook, including Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, who brought expertise in financial schemes and ruthless enforcement to Luciano's circle. These alliances gave Luciano a network of support that spanned beyond the Italian-American Mafia, incorporating Jewish and Irish mobsters into his plans. Tensions between Luciano and Masiria eventually reached a boiling point. Luciano knew that as long as Masiria held power, his vision for a modernized crime syndicate would remain out of reach. The solution was brutal but inevitable: betrayal. Luciano orchestrated one of the most infamous power plays in Mafia history. In 1931, Masiria was lured to a restaurant, where he was assassinated by hitmen linked to Luciano's allies. With Masiria gone, Luciano's path to revolutionizing organized crime seemed clear, but eliminating one rival was only the beginning. The vacuum created by Masiria's death drew the attention of Salvatore Maranzano, another powerful boss who sought to claim the title of boss of bosses. Maranzano, however, shared many of the same traditionalist values that Luciano despised. As Luciano began consolidating his power, he faced a new challenge. Could he maintain control without succumbing to the very structures he sought to dismantle? The bloody coup that ended Masiria's reign was a turning point for Luciano, marking his transition from an ambitious underling to a kingpin with a vision. But in the world of organized crime, success breeds enemies, and betrayal often begets betrayal. Luciano had risen to power through calculated violence and strategic alliances, but as he looked to the future, one question loomed large: how long could he stay on top in a world where trust was the rarest currency of all? In 1929, the criminal underworld faced a pivotal moment. Organized crime was expanding rapidly, fueled by the profits of Prohibition, but it was also plagued by infighting and bloodshed. Rivalries between crime families often spiraled into violent wars, drawing the unwanted attention of law enforcement. It was in this volatile environment that Charles Lucky Luciano saw an opportunity to change the game. He envisioned a unified syndicate, where cooperation replaced conflict and profits flowed unimpeded. To achieve this, he needed to bring the nation's most powerful criminals together under one roof. The result was the Atlantic City Conference, a meeting that would alter the course of organized crime forever. The conference was held at the luxurious Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Atlantic City, New Jersey. It was no coincidence that Luciano chose this location. Atlantic City was a playground for the wealthy, where illegal gambling and bootlegging thrived under the protection of corrupt local officials. The city's relaxed atmosphere provided the perfect cover for the meeting. On the surface, it appeared to be a gathering of businessmen enjoying a seaside vacation. Behind closed doors, however, it was anything but leisurely. The guest list was a who's who of organized crime. Luciano's allies, including Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, played key roles in organizing the event. Al Capone, the infamous Chicago mob boss, was among the most prominent attendees, his larger-than-life presence commanding attention. Leaders from crime families across the country arrived, each bringing their own ambitions, suspicions, and grudges. The stakes were immense. For many of these men, their attendance was not just a gamble on Luciano's vision, but a bet on their own survival. The agenda was clear: to establish a national crime syndicate that could coordinate operations, settle disputes, and divide territories without resorting to violence. Luciano presented his plan with the calm confidence of a man who had thought of every detail. The profits of Prohibition, he argued, were too great to risk losing to unnecessary wars. If they worked together, the syndicate could expand its reach beyond bootlegging into labor racketeering, narcotics, and even legitimate businesses. The idea was revolutionary, but it came with significant risks. Trust was scarce in this world, and alliances could shatter in an instant. While many were drawn to Luciano's vision, not everyone was convinced. Al Capone, whose iron grip on Chicago made him a force to be reckoned with, agreed in principle but remained wary of the hidden agendas in the room. Capone's concerns were not unfounded. Luciano, despite his promises of equality, was quietly positioning himself as the linchpin of the syndicate. His alliances with key figures like Lansky gave him a strategic advantage, but it also sowed seeds of distrust among the other bosses. The conference concluded with what appeared to be a unanimous agreement. Territories were divided, operations were streamlined, and disputes were settled. For the first time, organized crime had a framework for cooperation. But beneath the surface of unity, cracks began to form. Luciano's calculated maneuvering had left some bosses feeling sidelined, and whispers of betrayal began circulating almost as soon as the meeting ended. The Atlantic City Conference marked a triumph for Luciano's vision, but it also set the stage for future power struggles. As the attendees left the Ritz-Carlton, many wondered if the peace would last or if the seeds of greed and ambition would eventually tear their fragile alliance apart. The Atlantic City Conference had been a landmark achievement for Lucky Luciano, but peace in the criminal underworld was as fragile as it was fleeting. While the agreement brought a temporary sense of order, it didn't erase the deep-rooted rivalries and ambitions that defined the world of organized crime. Luciano's vision of a unified syndicate was ambitious, but ambition often invites betrayal. Behind the scenes, cracks in the alliance began to form, and it wasn't long before the bloody realities of power politics surfaced once again. One of the most significant tensions emerged with Al Capone. Despite agreeing to Luciano's proposals during the conference, Capone remained wary of Luciano's growing influence. Capone controlled the lucrative Midwest territories, and while Luciano had assured him autonomy, rumors swirled that Luciano was quietly backing rival factions to undermine his power. Capone, A master strategist in his own right, kept a close eye on Luciano, but he also had his own vulnerabilities. His flamboyant lifestyle and brutal tactics had attracted increasing scrutiny from law enforcement, leaving him exposed and isolated. Back in New York, Luciano faced his own challenges. Salvatore Maranzano, a traditionalist who had emerged as Luciano's rival after Joe Masseria's assassination, was determined to reclaim the old ways of the Mafia. Maranzano viewed himself as the undisputed boss of bosses, a title that directly clashed with Luciano's vision of equality among the crime families. Though Maranzano outwardly maintained a facade of respect, his resentment toward Luciano's modernized approach was no secret. Maranzano began to consolidate power, tightening his grip on New York's criminal operations. He issued strict orders to his followers and quietly plotted to eliminate Luciano, whom he saw as a threat to his authority. Maranzano underestimated Luciano's network of spies and informants, however. Word of the plot reached Luciano, and he knew he had to act quickly to neutralize the threat. In one of the most shocking twists in Mafia history, Luciano struck first. He orchestrated an audacious plan to eliminate Maranzano before the older boss could make his move. Luciano sent a team of hitmen, disguised as federal agents, to Maranzano's office. The assassination was swift and brutal, leaving no room for retaliation. Maranzano's death not only eliminated Luciano's most immediate rival but also marked the end of the old Mafia hierarchy. With Maranzano out of the way, Luciano stood unchallenged at the helm of the National Crime Syndicate. He had successfully dismantled the traditional power structures and replaced them with a corporate-style organization that operated with ruthless efficiency. Yet even as Luciano solidified his position, the seeds of betrayal and dissent continued to grow. Luciano's actions at the conference and his subsequent moves had made him powerful, but they had also earned him a long list of enemies. Some of the attendees at Atlantic City felt they had been manipulated into supporting a system that disproportionately benefited Luciano and his closest allies, particularly Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel. Resentment simmered beneath the surface, and whispers of revenge began to circulate in the shadows. The elimination of Maranzano was a triumph for Luciano, but it came with a cost. By proving that he was willing to betray and kill even those who worked alongside him, Luciano had cemented his reputation as a dangerous and unpredictable figure. In the world of organized crime, alliances were fragile and trust was non-existent. Luciano had built a criminal empire, but the foundations were already beginning to crack. As his enemies bided their time, one question loomed. How long could Luciano's reign last before the forces he had unleashed turned against him? With the old Mafia hierarchy dismantled and his syndicate in place, Lucky Luciano seemed invincible. He had risen from the streets of the Lower East Side to become the most powerful figure in organized crime. From his luxurious penthouses to his tailored suits, everything about Luciano exuded control and sophistication. Behind the facade, however, cracks were forming in the empire he had worked so hard to build. The very success that had propelled him to the top now made him a target not just for his rivals, but for law enforcement as well. By the mid-1930s, Luciano had expanded his operations far beyond bootlegging. His influence stretched into labor unions, gambling, narcotics, and even legitimate businesses. But this sprawling empire came at a cost. The bigger it grew, the harder it became to control. Luciano relied heavily on lieutenants like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel to manage operations, but not everyone under his leadership shared his vision or his loyalty. Whispers of dissatisfaction began circulating among his associates, fueled by jealousy over his wealth and power. While Luciano focused on maintaining his grip on the underworld, a formidable adversary was closing in on him. Special Prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey had made it his mission to dismantle organized crime in New York. Dewey was relentless, methodical, and incorruptible, a combination that made him one of the most dangerous threats Luciano had ever faced. Dewey was determined to bring down the crime syndicate, and Luciano was at the top of his list. Dewey found his opening in an unlikely place, Luciano's involvement in prostitution rings. While Luciano operated in the shadows, the women he exploited worked in plain sight. Dewey's team gathered testimonies from several women, piecing together a damning case against Luciano. For all his careful planning and calculated moves, Luciano had underestimated the vulnerability of this part of his empire. In 1936, Luciano was arrested and charged with compulsory prostitution. The trial was a media sensation, shining a spotlight on the shadowy world of organized crime. Prosecutors painted Luciano as a ruthless kingpin who exploited women and profited from their suffering. Despite his wealth and influence, Luciano found himself cornered. Dewey's evidence was overwhelming, and Luciano was convicted and sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. For the criminal underworld, Luciano's downfall was a seismic event. His imprisonment left a power vacuum that others were eager to fill. Some of his closest allies, including Meyer Lansky, worked to keep the Syndicate running in his absence, but the cracks in the organization widened. Rivalries that had been suppressed under Luciano's rule began to resurface, leading to internal conflicts and power struggles. Even behind bars, Luciano tried to maintain his influence. He communicated with his associates through intermediaries, issuing orders and attempting to hold his empire together. But his power was waning, and his enemies sensed an opportunity. As law enforcement ramped up its efforts to dismantle the Syndicate, Luciano's vision of a unified crime empire began to unravel. Luciano's imprisonment marked the beginning of the end for the golden age of the National Crime Syndicate. His dream of a cohesive, corporate-style organization was slipping away, replaced by chaos and infighting. The man who had once seemed untouchable now faced an uncertain future, locked away from the world he had fought so hard to control. But Luciano was not one to accept defeat easily, and even in his darkest moments he was already plotting his next move. Lucky Luciano's imprisonment seemed like the end of an era, but his story was far from over. Even behind bars, his mind never stopped scheming, and his influence on the criminal underworld lingered. For years he had ruled with a combination of strategy and brutality, but his conviction in 1936 sent shockwaves through the world of organized crime. Though his empire began to splinter, Luciano's ambition remained intact. From his prison cell, he worked to ensure that his name and his power would not fade into obscurity. World War II provided an unexpected opportunity for Luciano to reassert his influence. By 1942, the U.S. government was increasingly concerned about the possibility of Axis sabotage along the East Coast, particularly in New York's harbors. Rumors of enemy spies and saboteurs operating within the docks reached federal authorities, but the waterfront was controlled by the Mafia and network Luciano had built. Desperate to secure the ports, officials turned to the very man they had imprisoned years earlier. Through intermediaries, the government struck a secret deal with Luciano, in exchange for his assistance in ensuring the docks remained free of sabotage and in gathering intelligence for the war effort, Luciano would receive favorable treatment. Though confined to prison, he used his connections to broker cooperation between the Mafia and the U.S. Navy. The deal, known as Operation Underworld, demonstrated the enduring reach of Luciano's power, even as a prisoner. Luciano's cooperation proved valuable, and his wartime contributions did not go unnoticed. In 1946, after serving just 10 years of his sentence, his efforts were rewarded. He was granted parole on the condition that he be deported to Italy, never to return to the United States. For Luciano, the prospect of exile was bittersweet. He was leaving behind the country where he had built his empire, but he was also being given a chance to rebuild his life and his operations from afar. Once in Italy, Luciano wasted no time in re-establishing his presence in the criminal world. Though his movements were monitored by Italian authorities, he worked to reconnect with his old associates and expand his influence. His focus shifted to international drug trafficking, a lucrative trade that spanned continents. Luciano acted as a coordinator, using his network to facilitate the smuggling of narcotics from Europe to the United States. The operation was vast and complex, and though Luciano was far from his former power, he remained a force to be reckoned with. But Luciano's life in exile was not without challenges. The rise of new leaders within the American Mafia meant that his once absolute authority had diminished. Younger, more ruthless figures began to dominate the scene, and while they respected Luciano's legacy, they operated on their own terms. Luciano, once the architect of organized crime's golden age, found himself increasingly isolated from the empire he had built. Gay Orlova, a featured dancer in Hollywood, one of Broadway's top nightclubs, was introduced to Luciano in 1929. They never got married, but they were inseparable until he was sent to prison. He later referred to Agia Lissoni, a Milanese ballerina who was 20 years his junior, as the love of his life after they first met in early 1948. Lissoni moved in with him in the summer. The pair just exchanged rings, according to some stories, but others claim they were married in 1949. Living together at Luciano's Naples home was Lissoni. He persisted in having extramarital encounters, which led to numerous disputes with Lissoni, during which he physically abused her. Lissoni passed away from breast cancer in 1959. Luciano didn't have any kids. At one point, he explained why: "I didn't want no son of mine to go through life as the son of Luciano, the gangster. That's one thing I still hate Dewey for, making me a gangster in the eyes of the world." In 1962, Luciano's life came to an end under mysterious circumstances. While meeting with a film producer to discuss a movie about his life, he collapsed and died of a heart attack. Some speculated foul play, given his controversial past and remaining enemies. His death marked the conclusion of a career that had reshaped the criminal underworld and left an indelible mark on history. Lucky Luciano's legacy was one of contradiction, a man who rose from the slums to build a criminal empire, who unified warring factions yet fostered distrust, and who worked with the government while remaining an outlaw. His life was a testament to ambition and cunning, but it also served as a reminder of the inevitable cost of power. Though his empire crumbled and his vision of unity faded, Luciano's name became synonymous with the dark and shadowy world of organized crime. Thank you for watching Mystery Minds. If this story intrigued you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more chilling tales of true crime. What do you think about Lucky Luciano's rise and fall? Let us know in the comments below, and as always, stay curious, stay vigilant, and stay safe.